as the founding dean of our School of International Relations, and I was talking to the colleagues, and the economists said, well, we need to hire some people to work on the economy of China and the economy of Latin America. I said, why would you do that? There's only economics. And I was really shocked by that, but that was a view, and we eventually did. It was from a power point of view, one of the reasons why I worked very hard to make sure that our School of International Relations and Pacific Studies, the UCSD, had its capacity to appoint its own professors. We do not have to make joint appointments with economics or political science. We could appoint our own people. And the reason I pushed for that was that I kept pointing to the economists who didn't want to give us that power. I said, but you don't want to let us hire. You agree that the mission of our school is to teach about the economies of these regions, but you don't want us to be able to hire anybody who would do that. So if that's what you insist on doing, we cannot proceed with creating a School of International Affairs. And if you insist on it, I will resign my job as chair of this committee, go to the chancellor and say, I can't work with these people. And they gave up. So we did hire economists like China, Latin America, Japan, and all these other people. And now the economics department is actually very happy about it, because they actually now find all of that quite interesting. So I find that a positive sign in this complicated world. That's one of my big generalizations of the whole talk, is that the way that the particular and the individual has become theoretically interesting. So the Washington Consensus strikes me as its own form of kind of a structural determinism about the uniformity of development trajectories. And as Lourdes said, I've always hated that from Barrington Moore on, that there are many paths, and Stanley Hoffman, people like that I studied, where there are many paths to get where you want to go. And so that, the interesting debate that I think, the other thing that I think that the rise of the BRICS has done, I think, has demolished another piece of the Washington Consensus, which is the phobia about the role of the state. The idea that states play no constructive role in economic development, which strikes me as a very big part of the ideology of the Washington Consensus, and remains a very, very powerful ideology in at least the United States and the UK, that this is certainly is politically a very powerful ideology. As we see over the current battle about how much regulation is required to prevent crises like this in the future, that is the victory of the Republicans at the last Senate congressional election meant that all the battles for regulation are going to be that much more difficult. But I think that it's very interesting for us as social scientists, because we're a little bit freer from that. I think in the social sciences, this has been a very interesting debate, both in thinking about what was wrong with apendency and what was wrong with the Washington Consensus. How did countries actually move their way out of the trap of underdevelopment? How did they get there? Is a battle over the role of the state. That I don't know how many of you may remember that in the 1990s, when it finally began to dawn on people that East Asia was doing remarkably well, that there was a big meeting that produced, any of you remember the East Asian Miracle Report that we generated. Well, that is a very fascinating document in the history of economic ideas, because it was a document which came out of an effort of the World Bank people to reflect on how would they make sense out of East Asia. And the Americans wanted to say, I remember colleagues say, well, they did it in the traditional ways. They just had a high savings rate. State bullshit. The state didn't do anything. They didn't play a role. They just had a high savings rate. Well, if you pushed it, why did they have a high? Could you really explain a high? Even if you bought that, could you explain a high savings rate separate from a variety of national policies? Okay. But the Japanese would not have any of that. The Japanese were not going to allow a report to come out that pushed that particular ideology, because they didn't think that was their model, and they didn't think that's what the East Asian NICs were doing, and they didn't think that was a successful model. They thought that the successful model was one with quite an active state role of industrial policy. Robert Wade was just here, I think, and I saw him on the program, and the people began writing about development policy, industrial policy, and that was an argument about exactly what could the state do in a constructive way to promote economic development. And I think in Latin America, that fight appeared here as a battle between ISI and export substitution, right? The dominant view at the time when we were children and first met, the dominant view was an ISI view, import substitution view, and East Asia represented the export approach, that if you learned how to export, you could do better, but contained within that was an idea not only the way to learn how to export was to have aggressive competition at home. and I think this is neglected, that there was a lot of intense competition in Japan and in Korea. They kept out foreign investment, but they did not prevent them from competing with each other. So it was the export substitution was a big fight over that. And then the next generation of that debate, I think, occurred in the very fascinating debate over deregulation of the transition economy, right? The collapse of the Soviet model created topics for people to study, some of whom I see here, about what would the transition economy is going to look like. How would one make sense out of the transition model? And that interacted with this turn away from state. So that's the transition from the former Soviet economies into whatever we want to call it, whatever they do now, which is these mixed market economies. But remember that that was happening at the same time that there was a big wave of back off from a high state running of the economy, of transition to democratization in South America and other places, so that the same issue was appearing in very different political systems with very different histories about how to understand transition economies. And I watched that very fascinating because out in San Diego I was surrounded by people. There was, if some of you recall, the Big Bang versus gradualism argument of Andre Schleifer and people like that were arguing for Big Bang. And my colleagues out in San Diego who were experts on China and East Asia, the ones the economics department didn't want to hire, they were arguing that the Big Bang approach was a terrible mistake. They were the leading protagonists of the gradualism approach with what China did, which is, and the logic of it was very interesting, which is that, remember the best single formulation I heard a friend of mine make about it was that the trouble with the Big Bang approach was it assumed that you could have perfect information immediately, right? You just deregulate it and let things take care of themselves. That would assume that everybody knew what the prices were. And so they said if Big Bang were possible, so would planning be. Because planning believes that the central administrator knows the actual prices. And the problem with planning is that they don't. And Big Bang assumes that the minute you deregulated, everybody would know what the prices were, and you don't. And the gradualism approach was, you're better off doing this gradually because since markets are a matter of learning back and forth from a competitive situation what the prices are, that would work a lot better. And I think that the Big Bang approach was, I think, built on a deep misreading of what actually happened in Europe after World War II. It was they pointed to Germany all the time and said, Ludwig Erhard had the bonfire of controls. I don't know what that is in German, Hans. Jürgen, you can tell me, but destroy all the controls after World War II, and then the German economy took off. So people point at that and say, see, that worked very well, so that's what the Russians would do. But what they didn't mention was that Germany actually had, prior to that moment, prior to the Nazis, actually had a pretty vigorous civil society, a lot of people with a lot of understanding of what they did. They recreated the institutions of civil society. First, the trade unions came back, the guys who owned the factory before got. So you had people who were ready to make this thing work, and then you could deregulate. And the trouble in Russia, if you did that, if you destroyed everything without any structures underneath, it wouldn't work quite the way it was. And so that is, I think, a very interesting debate about the relationship between civil society institutions, social institutions, and state structures, and economic deregulation about what's actually going to, under what conditions, how these things interact, so that it's actually going to work. And so I think we're living this very fascinating, this remains, I think, a huge topic for us comparatively. I think that the events in Egypt are very fascinating for many, many reasons, but one of them that fascinates me is the way, another one of the things that we're used to not linking together. I was in Turkey for a month in September, and what's fascinating in Turkey is that you have a government which is relying on Islamic support, which at least gets some talking about, appeals to some Islamic units, but it's a very pro-market government. It's all in favor of deregulation, and it's all, it had a fight with it's the Kemalists who are statists, and the Islamicists who are sympathetic to deregulation, and that, I can see some frowns in the auditorium. Yeah, that is the interesting thing, and I hear that debate is now taking place in Egypt. If the Islamicists acquire more power, many people are used to thinking that means a statist, that means Iran. But it doesn't. In some parts of the world, it doesn't mean that. And Egypt and Turkey is an interesting example of people working on a different kind of combination of what they're going to do.